ability to foretell what is going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and to have the ability afterwards to explain why it didn't happen. Churchill managed to be elected to Parliament as a Tory, a Liberal, an Independent, and then a Tory again, and each time had a persuasive explanation as to why things hadn't worked out quite as predicted. His successors from all parties seem to have lost the art of the convincing reverse ferret. Last year, Labour said they wouldn't raise taxes. They're going up. Before them, the Conservatives said they'd bring down immigration numbers. They went up. Before them, the Liberal Democrats swore they'd never back an increase in university tuition fees. They leapt to £9,000 a year. And just this week, the Reform leader Nigel Farage told us that he couldn't deliver his promise of tax cuts. Given this history, it would be easy to lose faith and to become cynical about the system that so many gave so much to defend. But maybe today should be a spur for those who are elected, as well as those of us who report politics, to try harder to show that the sacrifice was worth it, and that Churchill was right when he famously said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. In 2 hours' time, at 11 o'clock, the country will fall silent for 2 minutes, to remember, as we do every year on this Remembrance Sunday, all those who have given their lives for our country in conflict. This is the scene now live at the Cenotaph on Whitehall in central London, with thousands gathering to pay their respects. This year is as poignant as ever. Countries across Europe are rearming as war rages on our continent, and thousands of men, women and children are dying each year in Ukraine to hold back the advance of Russian forces. Earlier, I was joined by the most senior military officer in this country, the Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Richard Knighton. Sir Richard Knighton, it's 80 years since the end of the Second World War. Why does this Day of Remembrance remain relevant?
I think Remembrance Sunday is always an important day for those of us in uniform. It's a day when the whole nation comes together to remember those who fought and died for their country and fighting for our freedom, and to remember the families and the loss that they have suffered. But it's also a day for personal reflection as well. For me, this marks the 30th anniversary since the loss of the Nimrod at Toronto. So during those 2-minute silence, I will be paying a particular thought for the friends I lost that day. But I think as we look at the world being more dangerous, more volatile, more uncertain, as the Prime Minister described it, it's important that we remember the cost of war. And I always reflect at this time of year with pride on the service of those who are in uniform today and the families that support them and bear their absence while they're on duty.
Could you remind us about the Nimrod tragedy and why it matters to you particularly?
So I'd been at RAF Kinloss on my very first tour in the Royal Air Force, and it was shortly after I finished at RAF Kinloss that the Nimrod crashed in September of 1995, 2nd of September, in fact. It was exactly 30 years to the day since I started in this role. And I remember with great fondness the friends that I lived with and worked with at RAF Kinloss who were killed that day.
There are some who sacrifice a great deal who might on this day be wondering if the generations that came after really value that sacrifice. I want to play you the words of one veteran, and he was speaking this week to ITV's Good Morning Britain.
I can see in my mind's eye those rows and rows of white stones of all the hundreds of my friends and everybody else that gave their lives for what? The country of today. No, I'm sorry. The sacrifice wasn't worth the result that it is now.
That is Alec Penstone. What would you say to him?
Well, today of all days, I would say to Alec that what he did and the sacrifice of his friends was worth it. The peace and stability that the Second World War ushered in has been fundamental to the prosperity and freedom that we have enjoyed. And when we look at other nations across the world where they haven't had the freedom and stability that we've enjoyed for 80 years, you can see the level of suffering. So today of all days, I would say to Alec, what you did and the sacrifice that your comrades and friends made was worth it for the nation.
We have these solemn rituals every year, but of course men and women are putting themselves in harm's way every day. If you had to fight a war next year, are we ready militarily?
Well, I know that the men and women of the armed forces are always ready to do their duty, but what we also know is that the threats are changing. The Strategic Defence Review that was published earlier in the year described how there's a return of great power competition, there's this greater levels of uncertainty and volatility. And we know that our armed forces have enjoyed the benefits of the peace dividend over the last 30 years, and the Strategic Defence Review described the hollowing out of the armed forces. So that's why, despite the wonderful professionalism and the commitment of our armed forces, we need to modernise, we need to invest, and we need to improve the readiness. And so for me, as the head of the armed forces, my number one priority is warfighting readiness.
You use the term hollowed out, by which people mean loss of numbers of personnel, loss of capability. Are the armed forces still hollowed out?
So we know that we have gaps in things like weapon stockpiles. We know that we don't have all the people that we need. And that's why the Strategic Defence Review set out that these were areas of priority for us to invest in. And we can see benefits and improvements already. So, for example, over the last year, we've seen more people join the armed forces than leave, and that's the first time that's been the case since 2021. But we mustn't be complacent. The world is a more dangerous place than it was a year ago, and therefore we need to continue to drive to improve our warfighting readiness.
What you've just said about the state of our armed forces is not new, though I think you're franker than many military leaders. Mr. Putin must smile.
So Mr. Putin right now is losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. We had over 1 million casualties in Ukraine. His nation is spending somewhere around 40% of its national income on defence. Putin strategically is seeing his war aims eroded. We've got a stronger NATO rearming, a bigger NATO. And so I think right now we should be confident that NATO is stronger and more capable than Russia, and that Russia is losing from a strategic perspective, even if it's making tactical gains on the ground in Ukraine.
Well, how do you assess the state of the war in Ukraine? I know it's naive to talk about who's winning and who's losing, but what are the balance of forces right now?
So we know that Russia is a bigger nation than Ukraine. We know that it's making small but painfully slow advances on the ground. And then strategically, as I described earlier, NATO is stronger, NATO is larger, NATO's committed to rearm. We saw our Prime Minister alongside other leaders in the Hague NATO summit committing to spend 5% of GDP on defence and security. And so the fundamental war aims that Russia had of subjugating Ukraine, he's failing against them. But Russia is a big, powerful nation, and Ukraine needs our support. And the work that we have done as a country, as a nation, and our armed forces have done to support Ukraine is helping keep them in the fight and bring pressure onto Russia. Let's
talk about our armed forces and our future. Nature of war is changing. You mentioned the 5% ambition. The government said it wants to get to 3% of GDP in the next parliament. Are we getting there fast enough?
So I think the commitment that the government's made and NATO nations have made around 5% of government spending on defence and security is completely unprecedented. Just before I finished as the head of the Air Force, on the last day I was at RAF College Cranwell, where our cadets graduate and become officers, and I was saying to them that they are entering a world in our armed forces and Air Force that I have never known. The largest sustained increase in defence spending is unprecedented in my entire career. What we know, though, is that the threats are changing, and so that's why we need to focus on
modernisation. And they're coming on pretty fast, aren't they? I mean, you know, we can promise 5%, but if the 5% doesn't arrive ahead of the realisation of threat, it's meaningless.
Well, the Prime Minister has said that his first duty in government is the safety and security of the nation. So what the government has done is made a very significant commitment to increase defence spending, I say completely unprecedented in my career. And I'm sure that if the world around us changes, given that that is their priority and their principal responsibility, I'm sure that position will change.
Well, of course, let's talk about how you would spend that money. What are the new threats that are emerging? We know about cyber, we read about drones, there are other ways in which countries are being destabilised. What do you fear most?
I think the evolution of technology has lowered the barriers for entry of nations to higher levels of capability than we have known. So throughout my service life, we have enjoyed in the West an advantage over our adversary. But the emergence of space as a warfighting domain, cyber as a means of disrupting a nation, the evolution of digital technology and uncrewed technology, you see the drones and the terrible attack last night in Ukraine, all of those require us to evolve and modernise and develop our own armed forces. And I think as I look to the future, the thing that I want to ensure is that we in the UK and in the West are able to adapt our armed forces faster than our adversary. And we've seen why that's worked in Ukraine.
I think you were saying that we are helping other NATO members, particularly with the drones question.
Exactly right. So we know that drones are becoming a real issue in a number of countries. We saw it in Denmark ahead of the summit there. We saw it in Germany, and most recently in Belgium. I had my Belgian opposite number, the Chief of Defence Staff, in touch with me this week, seeking our help to track and potentially defeat their drones. And we agreed with the Defence Secretary on Friday that we would send our people and our equipment into Belgium to help them with the current problem that they've got there.
Very quick last question. Mr. Trump says that the United States wants to test a nuclear device, first time in 30 years. Should he?
Well, it's not for me to comment on or provide advice to the President of the United States of America, but we know that the nuclear umbrella that we have sat under, both as a nation and alongside our ally, the US, has been fundamental to the stability of the position in Europe over the last 80 years.
OK. I think I read from that we are sticking with the Americans.
So from a UK perspective, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is not something that we will be amending. But I can't comment on what the President said or may not have said in his tweets. And there's no formal policy position that's yet emerged from the US system.
Sir Richard Knighton, thank you very much for your time this morning.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That was the Chief of Defence Staff, and we'll talk about his interview to our panel a little later. But right now, let's speak live to the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Good morning.
Good morning.
You're announcing funds today for the repair and maintenance of local war memorials. Can I just ask, do you have any plans for the many memorials to fallen Commonwealth troops?
Yes, so this week you saw the Deputy Prime Minister pay tribute to all of the troops who served in our country, not just troops who served from the United Kingdom, but across the whole of the Commonwealth, and we owe them a great debt. The war memorials that exist across our country pay tribute to veterans across the board. We are absolutely crystal clear that it is not an acceptable situation that so many of them have been able to fall into neglect and disrepair, and that's why we're announcing £2 million today to make sure that we, in every town, village and city, that children growing up there understand the contribution that their grandparents and great-grandparents made to protect our peace and freedom, and that we pay tribute properly and restore those monuments to the condition that they ought to be in.
Thank you. I understand your time is short this morning, so can I just come straight to the point that I think a lot of people in the country will be thinking about this morning? Do we know how many wrongly released prisoners are currently being hunted? The number we are told is 4, but can you confirm that?
Well, in terms of the numbers that have been released, the figure that is publicly available is 4, but I haven't had any discussions with the Justice Secretary about that this morning. What I can tell you is that under the last government, for quite some time, there were on average 17 wrong releases. Under this government, that has risen, it's 22. That is completely unacceptable. It was unacceptable before, it's unacceptable now. Even 1 is too many. And the Justice Secretary is gripping this by appointing Dame Lynn Owers, who is the former director of the National Crime Agency, to make sure that we really grip this, starting with the antiquated paper-based system that was developed in the 1980s that is still being used, building new prisons and making sure that we have additional checks so that people aren't wrongly released.
You say that the Justice Secretary is gripping this. When he was asked this week about wrongly released prisoners at large, he refused to answer, didn't come back to the House when he had the opportunity. Does that evasiveness mean that, doesn't that evasiveness mean that it will be very difficult for any government minister to be believed on this question?
I don't accept that he was being evasive. I was in the House of Commons chamber
Well, he was
for
asked 5
Prime
times,
Minister's
didn't
questions.
give an answer.
Well, I was there, Trevor, and I was sitting next to the Home Secretary, and I could see that he was weighing up in his mind what information to release. He was asked about an asylum seeker. The case in question was not an asylum seeker. And I think all of us as ministers have an obligation to make sure that when we do speak about matters of such significance to the public and put information into the public domain, that we do that with care and make sure that the full facts are presented. He was very quick then to release the details of the case, which, like I said, was not an asylum seeker, but is a very serious case. And he is making a statement to Parliament this week.
Forgive me, the whole point of questions in Parliament is for ministers to answer. Why didn't he just say, I can't tell you for this reason or that reason, instead of mounting an attack on the opposition for their supposed record? Why didn't he just say, I can't tell you?
Well, look, I'm known
He
as
had
a
information in front of him, which he could have read out. He didn't.
Look, I'm known as a fairly straight talker in politics, but I really strongly feel that if you, when you speak about matters of public importance, you have to take great care in order to make sure that that information is completely accurate. And if he'd taken the advice that you've just given, Trevor, and said that he couldn't say, can you imagine the reaction from journalists like yourself, broadcasters across the board? I think it would have increased.
Well, the alternative is what we've got now, which is that we are still talking about his performance at PMQs 4 days after. Wouldn't it have been simpler for him to be straightforward and say, I cannot tell you?
Well, as a government, what we're talking about and what we're doing is gripping the actual challenge. And the challenge is that the prison system was nearly full to capacity when we were elected just 16 months ago, where you've got a system of a paper-based system that belongs in the 1980s, was constructed in the 1980s, that causes confusion, where you've got new prison places that just haven't been built over a really long period of time. We built 28,000 new places when we were last in government. The Conservatives added just 500. Now, that is not to make excuses. This is our problem now, and we are going to grip it. But I do want people to understand the seriousness of the situation that we inherited and the work that we're doing to turn it around.
So I'm sorry to rush you along, but I understand that you're having to go. But we can't let you go without asking you about the news this morning that the Home Secretary is apparently studying migration policy in Denmark as a model. The centre-left government there has imposed tougher restrictions on immigration, harder for asylum seekers to bring in their families. The authorities can even confiscate people's jewelleries on the street. Is that the kind of immigration system that your government wants to bring in?
Well, first of all, can I apologise that this is so short? I'm escorting the King to the cenotaph in just a moment, so I obviously don't want to be late. But
I will defer to His Majesty.
In terms of the immigration policy that you described, the Home Secretary makes no apology for the fact that she is looking at a whole range of measures to grip the chaos that we inherited from the last government, and she will leave no stone unturned to do so. We haven't made any specific announcements about specific policies, but in terms of asylum seekers making a contribution, one of the single biggest things that we've done in the last year is speed up asylum claims so that people who shouldn't be here are removed and people who can be here and have the right to be here can get on and work and contribute to this country.
But I know you know a lot about this territory. You wouldn't feel uncomfortable about the Denmark approach, would you?
Well, like I said, we haven't made any announcements about specific measures in Denmark, and we haven't discussed those as a cabinet. But I think the right of people to contribute who have the right to be here is absolutely well understood. I think the public would expect that from us, and we're looking at a range of measures to make sure that we can deal with the chaos that we inherited.
Forgive me, one last one. Do you agree with your colleague and I think she's a constituency neighbour, Lucy Powell, that the Chancellor must stick to the manifesto and not raise income tax, national insurance or VAT?
Look, we take our promises very, very seriously, and we did make specific commitments around tax in the manifesto, but we were also elected on a promise to change this country, and through the record investment that we've been able to put into the National Health Service, we're seeing waiting times coming down and more appointments being made available. On a whole range of measures, we're delivering the change that people want to see. We are going to have to make difficult decisions in order to do that.
With respect to your own time, I just asked if you agreed with Lucy
I'm not going to
Powell.
write the budget live on air.
No, I'm not asking you that. I'm asking if you agreed with Lucy Powell or not.
Well, I agree with Lucy Powell that promises matter. I also agree with her that the situation that this government inherited is very challenging. We've got to make fair choices. And like she said, in answer to a question about this, she will, of course, always support the Chancellor to make the right decisions in the interests of the country.
OK, but I think the signal has been clearly sent. Lisa Nandy, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Right, well, let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the chief political commentator for The Times, Patrick Maguire, the broadcaster and journalist, Daisy McAndrew, and the Telegraph columnist and interviewer, Kamal Ahmed. Daisy, did I sniff just a sense of a message to Rachel Reeves, honestly, stick to the manifesto?
Well, I mean, of course, that's what they would all like. It's such easy pickings for any of us to say, you know, liar, liar, pants on fire, because we can point to the manifesto and say, you're going back on it. So I mean, we all know it's an incredibly difficult time, and she's sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. She, the Chancellor, being stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I'm personally quite surprised that she's actually still in her job, the Chancellor. I sort of thought that Keir Starmer would take the easy way out at the last reshuffle and get rid of her, but I was obviously proved completely wrong, because then it would have been easier for a new broom to say, no matter what the previous Chancellor has promised, I'm different and I'm taking a realistic approach, and actually tough things have to be done. But she can't do that because it's, you know, she put it down in black and white in the manifesto.
Patrick, you're as well informed as any journalist of what's going on in the Labour hierarchy. First of all, do you think they've actually made a decision about what they're going to do yet?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Well, actually, many billions of pounds as opposed to a single $1 million. It's entirely possible, maybe plausible rather than... Well, actually, possible and possibly plausible that they find that the black hole is smaller than they expected, and they don't necessarily have to raise income tax and break the manifesto. But look, the proposal has gone to the OBR, the budget watchdog, and they wouldn't be rolling the pitch with such gusto if they didn't think there was a good chance they had to do it. That doesn't mean they're definitely going to do it, but it means it's probably likelier than not.
It being raised taxes?
Yes, well, and income tax specifically, which is obviously so totemic. And the problem, I think, I detect there is a lack of understanding that this would be such a massive breach of trust with the electorate, who already have very little trust in this government. I think that is the problem, and I think there is maybe a little bit of wishful thinking as to how this will go down.
Kamal, what do you think about Daisy's idea that actually the strategy here might be Rachel Reeves does the deed and then takes the hit?
Yeah. Certainly within Labour, Daisy, I think Daisy's absolutely right. Within the Labour Party, there are a number of MPs and senior figures in Labour who believe that Rachel will take the hit now and then resign after the May elections.
Yeah.
If she goes straight away, when she gave that interview saying, when she was asked by Andrew Marr, would you resign if you have to break the promise? And she said, well, the reaction of the markets would be terrible, is true. So at the moment, Rachel Reeves is speaking to the markets. She is trying to reassure the markets that she has control of the fiscal envelope for the government, and that's only by raising taxes, because the government will not cut spending and it will not increase borrowing. So she's only got tax, so she's reassuring the markets. There is a path, to Daisy's point, where she makes the decision to raise income tax in this budget, and then after May, and a disastrous result for Labour in Scotland, in Wales, and across the English local elections, Starmer and her then go. That is being spoken about in Labour circles. Now, whether that will happen, of course, as Sir Winston Churchill said, we can explain afterwards why it didn't or whether it did, as you said at the top of the programme. But that is certainly a discussion that they are making the sacrifice, almost the two of them, and then they depart.
Yeah.
You know what? She was here a year ago, and, I would not myself be doing this, but I suspect that lots of people may play this clip if she does put up taxes. You understand why I'm asking you this? Because people are going to be a bit nervous. She said this before, then she discovered it was a problem. Will we discover in 2 years' time that there's some reason why they've got to go up?
No.
Or is this an absolute commitment?
It's an absolute commitment. But let me just say this. We've now wiped the slate clean under the mismanagement and the chaos of the previous government. It's now on us. We've put everything out into the open.
Okay.
We've set the spending envelope for the course of this Parliament. We don't need to come back for more. We've done that now. We've wiped the slate clean.
So you're saying, actually, there's not going to be an Oliver Twist moment. You're not going to come back and say, we want another tax rise. Or if you did, that would be a huge failure for your government, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to be able to write 5 years' worth of budgets on this show today, but what we have done, there's no need...
will there be more tax rises?
You're right, Trevor, there is no need to come back with another budget like this. We never need to do that again. We've now, Trevor, set the spending envelope for the remainder of this Parliament. We don't need to increase taxes further. We need to do two things now. We need to reform our public services to make sure they work better, and we need to grow our economy.
If taxes do go up, how many times do you think that has to be played before?
One of the problems with any of these interviews is the reason we get this sort of robotic automatons as politicians is because they're so scared of these clips coming back to bite them on the posterior. And
I have to say, this is quite extreme, though, isn't it?
Oh, yes, of course.
And don't forget, Daisy and Trevor, she made the same pledge at the CBI Business Conference. I will not come back for more. So she wasn't only telling us journalists, and that will be one of those clips that will be run, but she was also telling businesses that she won't be coming back for more because the last budget was so damaging for business. And, of course, a lot of the campaigning, as you're suggesting by playing that clip, will be on social media. It won't be the discussion being had by, the mainstream media, but on TikTok, can you imagine? That clip will be shared millions and millions and millions of times, and that affects the type of voters that Labour is trying to get to that maybe don't watch all of the programmes that we appear on. So it's incredibly toxic for them.
Yeah.
How do they get out of this hole, Patrick?
I don't think they can, is the long and short of it. They can get out of the fiscal hole, that's what they're doing, and as Kamal said earlier, the markets are actually probably their easiest audience at the moment. And I think the Parliamentary Labour Party, Labour MPs, will quite enjoy voting through a series of tax rises until they hear from their constituents, struggling with the cost of living, who find their income taxes going up, and then actually look at a string of polls which, on current numbers, could have the Labour Party in 4th or 5th place by December.
But the only problem with saying the markets are OK is that is a bit of a red herring. The markets don't care about income tax. That's not their concern. It's whether any of us can afford to pay our bills is not the concern of the markets. They're concerned about bond prices and borrowing prices and so on. So if Rachel Reeves comes forward and says, I'm such a safe pair of hands because the markets quite like what I'm doing. It's the wrong message, because that doesn't mean that it's good for the country if it's good for the markets.
How long can they hold the view? The answer to every question you ask cabinet ministers is we inherited a mess. Have they run out of road on that one?
Yeah, I think they have for the public. I think they've been in power, obviously, now since the summer of last year, and the public is not hearing that strongly anymore. I think you have 6 months to a year to keep blaming and looking in the rear view mirror. Wasn't it interesting on your interview with Lisa Nandy? I thought she was going down the same route on the prisoner releases at fault. She said there were 17 under that last Conservative government, and I can reveal that we've only had 2, but she didn't do that. No. She said there were 17 under the last Conservative government, and they've gone up under us.
To 22.
So she couldn't even say, it's all those Conservatives' fault. I think there is a system issue, which, again, to the Lisa Nandy interview was really interesting, that the process is still paper and pen from the 1980s. I think we have to think, as well as being duly critical of politicians and the departments they run and how they behave, but also the system is so riven with archaic methods that, of course, are going to constantly fall down. We live in the 21st century and we have a 1980s system, and you can have the same conversation about fax machines in the NHS.
Yeah.
Patrick, she said, quoting here, it's our problem now. This is a new phase, isn't it? I mean, I haven't heard that since the election.
Well, no, it is Labour's problem, and I think there is an awareness. You could interpret that as an implicit rebuke to Rachel Reeves, who, in her slightly odd televised address at 8 a.m. the other morning, basically blamed everybody from Donald Trump to Rishi Sunak and via a
Vladimir Putin got an honourable mention.
Via Vladimir Putin, right, which blamed almost everybody, apart from herself, for the situation the government finds itself in. Now, up to a point, that is both accurate and astute politics. But I think, actually, as Kamal was saying, Kamal and Daisy was saying, the point at which they could get away with that, I think, has passed. They've been in power for 15, 16 months, and the public are no longer thinking in those terms.
And Daisy, there's a sort of what I think in the jargon they call atmospherics here, isn't there? There's this chart here which shows what has happened. Yeah. Actually, that's not the right chart, but I'll give you the right chart in a moment, which shows that number of prisoners released in error, up to 250, as Lisa Nandy was saying. But also, we have this, frankly, rather farcical business of prisoners being spotted on the street and arrested and all of that. And then the Lamé PMQ's debacle. There is a feeling that this is... The word that's being used is hapless. Yeah,
it is a complete shambles, but it has been for so long. I mean, if you look back, since Ken Clarke was Justice Secretary in 2012, we have had 13 Secretaries of State in that position. So they're averaging 1 a year. Now, you can't possibly get to grips with a department as complicated and as crucial as justice within a few months and hit the ground running. And so there are so many people to blame. Prime Ministers for reshuffling them because they don't think it's an important area, even though it is a very, very important political area.
Well, you think Keir Starmer would know that, of all people?
You would have thought he would have known it, but he's had
former Director of Public Prosecutions and so on, yes.
Exactly. You know, we've got the biggest prison population in Western Europe and the most inexperienced prison officers. I have a very close friend who's retrained recently from a management consultant, and she is now a prison warden at Wandsworth. Wow. And the stories she has told me about the paper system, about the total chaos, she's built her life organising systems, and she says she's never seen anything like it in her life.
To take up Daisy's point, here we go. This is prisoner officer experience. And you can see, we think it's probably the effect of austerity, increasing churn. Experienced prison officers have left. So from 2017 through to 2021, the numbers with 20 plus and 10 to 19 years declined, and the numbers just 4 years are up. Yeah, mistakes are going to abound, aren't they?
Absolutely. And I remember interviewing a prison governor who said that it's a fight to keep junior officers working in prisons because they can earn more stacking shelves at the local supermarket. And this is a highly intense job.
Yeah.
You are often at physical risk, mentally wearing. It's a very hard job to do. And the options to go and earn more money doing simpler things elsewhere is really obvious. And if you look at the private sector and public sector wages during austerity, not now, public sector wages are actually now rising faster than private sector wages, but during many of the austerity measures, private sector wages kept growing whilst public sector wages went down. And that has been the tension that so many of our public services have been unable to navigate. I just wanted to ask you, Patrick, what do you think about the Rachel Starmer post next May? I hear so much chat that they're almost throwing themselves off the cliff for the good of the economy, only to have to then go after the next local and national elections.
Yeah, I think Rachel Reeves in particular would probably dispute the idea that she's going to have to go. But it's absolutely right that, you know, to quote her, what she's saying on the record as well as in private, you know, putting the country before political expediency. But I think what's become clear in the past month is, one, that their fates are sort of inseparable. Yeah. When one goes, the other will have to go. And, you know, I had this conversation with MPs repeatedly over the past couple of months. It's sort of, initially it was, oh, will Rachel have to go if the budget's bad? Now there's an awareness that, well, if it's bad enough that she'll have to go, the Prime Minister will have to go as well. And that's something to bear in mind, by the way. If the political reaction to particularly a broken tax pledge is as bad as we think it could be, then all bets are off in terms of challenges to leadership and Rachel.
Yeah.
OK, well, we perhaps ought to remind ourselves that this government's been there 15, 16 years. There was a government before. It was a battle of the deputies at Prime Minister's questions this week. And as we know, it's not been a great week for Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy. My next guest was asking those questions about mistakenly released foreign prisoners. The Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartlidge, the Conservatives, who I spoke to just before we started the show. James Cartlidge, 80 years after the end of the Second World War, should we still be marking that moment?
Oh, definitely. I think it's incredibly important. In fact, in many ways more important than ever, because the key thing about this year, we had, as you know, the 80th anniversary, both the end of VE Day and VJ Day, which marked the end of the wars in Europe and in the Far East 80 years ago. And the thing, having, you know, attended both parliamentary debates about that, the thing that's so moving is that everyone talks about the end, inevitably, but sadly, of the living link to those who served, as in the end of the generation. Now, there are still some, and we saw them yesterday at the Festival of Remembrance, but we have to preserve that memory once the living link has gone. And so I think it's actually even more important, because the purpose of these events is to learn the lessons, isn't it? And that's why, you know, why do we stand up to Russia and support Ukraine? So that we don't experience that ever again.
Well, when you say we don't learn lessons, one of the lessons we perhaps need to learn is to make sure that our armed forces are up to scratch. They are war ready. The Chief of Defence Staff I spoke to this morning said that they had been hollowed out. And that happened on the watch of your government.
This phrase, hollowed out, came from Ben Wallace, who I had the privilege to serve under, an excellent Secretary of State.
The previous Secretary of State, yeah.
But one, Grant Shapps, the previous. Ben, that quote very clearly says under successive governments, which is always overlooked when it's used politically, and it wasn't meant to be used politically. It was making an honest observation that, you know, in 1985, when Gorbachev became Soviet Premier, and it was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, spending on defence was 5% of GDP, and every year since it has fallen because, and this is true of governments around the world, particularly in Europe, we thought we had a new era of peace, and that peace dividend was spent not on defence, it was spent on health and other things.
But you did have 15 years to fill the pot.
Well, I mean, OK...
14 years.
14 years. If you want to talk about the finances, you know, when we came to power, the budget deficit was over 10%. Now hold on a minute. They had just over 4% Labour when they took office, right? We had over 10%. It's an extraordinary position in which we found ourselves. You have to make some very difficult decisions across all departments in that situation. Having said that, you judge us by what actually happened in practice when we were challenged. Just made this point, just as we did with Mrs. Thatcher in the Falklands. And the way we stood by Ukraine, we were the only country at the beginning that stood by them, the only European country. The weapons we provided helped them to stay in the fight. And frankly, if they'd fallen early and Russia had conquered Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine, you'd have had a crisis like 80 years ago on our doorstep in Europe. So I'm very proud of what we did.
All right. This week you asked the Deputy Prime Minister 5 times, I think, about wrongly released prisoners. Now, strictly speaking, he was right to decline to answer your specific question, which is about asylum seekers, since Brahim Kadur Sharif, the man that was recaptured with the help of my Sky colleagues, wasn't an asylum seeker. But basically, you messed up the question, didn't you?
Well, when you say he was right, first of all, he's the Secretary of State. I'm merely, standing in for Kemi Badenoch as a member of the shadow cabinet at that point.
Don't do yourself down.
Wait a minute.
You're a dispatch box.
Yeah, but all I knew was we had a tip-off that there was another such case. We didn't know for certain. You can't know for certain unless you're running the department. And he stood up and answered my questions. He had at his fingertips the facts, and he's in front of Parliament. He has a ministerial code to be transparent, and he didn't answer the questions at all. And my judgment is that was a profound mistake and a discourtesy to Parliament, notwithstanding what it means for his adherence to the ministerial code. The fact is, and this is why I asked it, the public were extremely angry with what happened in the case in Epping, and I simply wanted to know, were there any other cases like that so that he could reassure the public, and he chose not to do so, and he chose not to do so when he knew the facts.
Are you saying that he misled the House, which is a resigning issue, I think?
Well, he couldn't have misled the House because he didn't answer the question at all. I mean, he made no attempt to. When I stood up and asked a very straightforward question...
But I think you just said that he broke the ministerial code.
Trevor, I said the question about the ministerial code is because there is a duty of transparency, right? I didn't say he misled the House because he didn't answer the question at all. But what is shocking, and I didn't know this at the time, he admitted it later, he knew about the other case, and he also had a statement ready for Parliament at his hand. The idea that he stood up in front of Parliament... Hold on, Trevor. He stood up in front of Parliament knowing the facts and chose not to share any of it when I was asking him to reassure the public is shocking.
If we're talking about being straight with the public, though, I'm just trying to get you to say what you took from that exchange. Did he mislead the House? Did he, in your opinion, break the ministerial code? Should he resign?
So, on misleading the House... to the extent that he withheld facts that he knew full well because they were in front of him, he certainly didn't answer the questions and was not transparent. So I think under the ministerial code, there's a question. Now, the ministerial code is overseen ultimately the Prime Minister. That's a question for him, and I think it's a really important one. We asked these things...
So you want the ethics advisor to launch an investigation?
I certainly think this has got to be looked into, and we will be raising it when the House returns. We've got Justice Questions is the first event when we return to Parliament on Tuesday. But I think it's the willingness to avoid the question at all, when what I was asking him, on behalf ultimately of the country, Trevor, is can he reassure people watching there aren't any more cases like this? And he knew there were, and he didn't answer.
I'll tell you why this is all a bit mysterious. Why didn't you just ask him what you just said? Are there people who shouldn't be wandering about the street? You had this tip-off. It all seemed a bit murky. Why didn't you just ask him directly?
I did ask him directly 5 times, and he chose not to answer at all. I asked him very directly. And I asked him about accidentally released. Someone who'd been let out of prison unintentionally. And the reason for that is because, as you know, Trevor, the number being released accidentally has soared. And when we had that in Epping, the public were outraged. And I wanted to ask, on behalf of the public of our country, for him to reassure us there were no other cases like that. And he knew there were, and he chose not to say anything.
I'm interrupting you because you made that point twice before. Yeah. But let me put this to you. Do you bear some responsibility, or your government? You cut funding during the years of austerity. I don't think anybody can argue about that. Experienced staff left, which I'm sure wasn't the intention, but that's what actually happened. I can show you. In 2017... the budget went down from 2010, and it fell to a low point around about 2016. Okay, it's recovered a bit, but nowhere near where it was. And the effect of this, I'll show you another graph. Actually, I can't show you that graph, but I'll tell you what it says. In 2017, the median length of service for prison staff was 12 years. By 2021, that had declined to 4 years. The budget cuts meant that there was great churn, and prisons were employing inexperienced people. Wouldn't it do something for honesty in politics if you simply acknowledge that actually some of this is your responsibility?
So, two parts to this. I already said at the beginning of the programme about the fact that we inherited a budget deficit over 10%. That's a country threatened with bankruptcy. We had a note left, there's no money left. Labour even admitted it, right? If you look at that spending...
Yeah, you made a choice.
But the public often don't understand the detail. So let me explain. The difference between a deficit of 4% or so that Labour inherited from us when they won the election in 24 and what we inherited from them in cash terms now is £160 billion. That's the entire NHS budget.
We discuss this a lot in our programme.
But that's why this happens.
Viewers understand that, but you made a choice about where you are going to impose austerity. To be honest. And here it is in prisons.
Trevor, you asked me to be honest, so I'm telling you why it happened honestly, and because of the finances of the country. In terms of the outcomes, the policy outcomes, what does this translate to? We were speaking about accidental releases from prison, right? Now, in every year that we were in office, the average number of accidental releases from prison was about 60.
But you're swerving the question I asked you, which is, do you accept any responsibility for the fact that the budget cuts that you chose to make meant that there were less experienced staff in prisons and they were bound to make the sort of mistakes we're seeing this week? Do you accept no responsibility at all for that?
I am accepting the fact that we had to make those difficult decisions. You've just said you chose to make, implying that we got to office, hey, let's now cut all the spending.
Yeah, I've asked you if you take responsibility. Your answer is three times it's somebody else's fault.
I didn't say that. I said I take responsibility for the fact we had to make very, very difficult spending decisions because of the state the country's finances were in. You're implying that we somehow voluntarily launched this so-called austerity. We didn't. We didn't have the money to fund departments in the way we wanted.
If I may say so, you're accepting responsibility for what somebody else did before you came into office, and you're saying that actually it was nothing much to do with you.
I've said we had to cut spending. So I'm being honest with you on air. Okay. Why do we have to do it? Because the country was on the cusp of bankruptcy. It had a budget deficit north of 10%. That's very, very serious for the country. Now, but you didn't let me finish the point about outcome. Because
wouldn't mind quickly.
Because as I said, the reason I raised that case in Prime Minister's questions is because the idea of accidental release from prison is incredibly serious. They averaged about 60 every year. We were in office 262 such cases in Labour's first year. But you're asking me about the truth. They're the stats, and that's what matters.
James Cartlidge, thank you for your time this morning. Well, back to our panel, Patrick Maguire, Daisy McAndrew and Kamal Ahmed. Sometimes watching these interviews back, I learn something that I don't observe when I'm actually doing it, which is we have both our big parties whose answer to everything is it's the other lot's fault.
Yeah, the not me gov is so frustrating, and I think it's something that we get quite tied up in the weeds and the detail of things. But yes, if you are just sitting at home watching that, you'll be pulling your hair out thinking, well, this is why I don't want to vote for any of them.
Yeah, it's 2025 and you have, I'd say about a third of your interview there was James Cartlidge talking about the budget deficit in 2010. I mean, if that's the Tory message to the country, after 14 years hence, during which they made plenty of mistakes, as he didn't quite acknowledge there, it's not. You wouldn't start from there if you were trying to win back public trust talking about Gordon Brown's government, would you?
It was a very good advert for reform.
I was just going to say, there is a substantive point there. I absolutely agree with the politics of it seeming ridiculous, but the very fact that this country spends more than it gains in revenues from taxes and from its investments, I think is one of the major issues. We have not paid back any of the debts that we are building up since 2003 and Gordon Brown. I think it's 2003, certainly the early 2000s and Gordon Brown. Every single year, we have to have a very serious debate in this country about the size of the state, the size of government, and what we spend money on. And I think that's a worthwhile debate, but I completely take the point you're making, Trevor, that we're now going back so far that the public are just giving up.
And the word we're not hearing very much at the moment, actually, is reform of public services. Both big parties have talked about this.
Well, it's interesting. Keir Starmer, in opposition, was saying he wasn't going to pull the tax lever or the spending lever, in his words. He was going to pull the growth lever, and also public services would need reform as a precondition before he gave them more money. Rachel Reeves immediately disproved that when she gave the NHS a £22 billion settlement in her first spending review and her first budget. And now it just seems the answer is, OK, we accept they need more money, have some more. You know, we have heard basically nothing about serious reform to public services beyond Peter Kyle telling everybody that they can use their phone as their ID in the pub. That's basically about it.
There's a very revealing report by the National Audit Office on police productivity a few days ago, which said that police productivity had hardly changed, despite endless Home Office policies to change the way the police fought crime.
Well, I wonder who's benefiting from this. Next, we'll hear from the leader of the Green Party, Zack Polanski.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin.
The waters of Ireland and Britain should be home to great white sharks.
If there are great white sharks in this area, there's no reason they wouldn't come here to feed. It's basically a buffet on a beach. This could be not only a record-breaking storm, but potentially the most dangerous storm ever to hit Ireland.
What might happen if Russia attacked the UK?
This is clearly an enormous show of force.
It is definitely out of the ordinary.
We ran a war game with former ministers back in the hot seat.
Ben Wallace.
Amber Rudd.
Jack Straw.
It's the kind of war game that's genuinely tested inside government.
The Russians are signalling that there may be an attack.
Russia knows our weaknesses, but do you? I'm Deborah Haynes. From Sky News and Tortoise, this is The War Game. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone, and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, DC.
Welcome back to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. This Remembrance Sunday morning, in just over an hour and a half, the nation will fall silent, remembering those who have given their lives in conflict. Silence will be led by the King at the Cenotaph here in central London. We can see the scene live now as veterans, politicians, members of the royal family and the public gather. We'll be bringing you those proceedings here live on Sky News from 10 a.m. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is just back from COP, but it feels like the consensus around reaching net zero that was in place has broken down. The Green Party is, of course, still committed to cutting carbon emissions, but it feels like we hear much more from them now on social issues, from redistribution and the economy to trans rights. So what's most important to them? And with their party riding high in the polls, what do they really stand for? Well, I spoke to the party's leader a little earlier. Zack Polanski, you'll be attending the Remembrance Day rituals today. Why does this day remain relevant?
It remains relevant because we still live in a world that's particularly in global turmoil right now, where the threat of war remains ever constant. And indeed, whether it's in Gaza or Sudan, there are conflicts and genocides happening throughout the world. I think the important moment to stop today is both to remember the fallen victims, to remember the world wars we've had, and also to look ahead towards peace and diplomacy, and how we can work together across nations to make sure that peace is never taken as something that is complacent or a given, but actually is always an active piece of work to strive towards a more peaceful world.
When you say fallen victims, you do include the military, the soldiers in that?
Yeah, undoubtedly, people who gave their life for this country.
Your party wants to get rid of nuclear weapons, move to emphasis onto diplomacy, development, and so on and so forth. If Greens were part of a government, would we expect to have fewer men and women under arms by the end of your term of office?
Well, I think that depends what's happening in the world. I think it would always be foolish to assume anything about military budgets without knowing the political context you're working in. I would say more widely, though, if we're talking about right now, we've got a Prime Minister who's spending £15 billion on nuclear weapons and at the same time saying there's no money to lift the two-child benefit cap, for instance, something that's keeping 350,000 children in poverty. So I think it's right to question political choices at budget time.
Surely the deterrent is valuable in a world that has Vladimir Putin in it.
Well, I want to see everyone denuclearise, including Vladimir Putin. But ultimately, the only way you can do that is by showing...
But I have to say, that would be in the realms of the miracle?
Well, you're laughing at it, but I think it's important that we don't laugh at peace. I think it's really important.
No, I'm laughing at the idea that Vladimir Putin is going to give up his nuclear weapons because somebody asks him to.
Well, you could have laughed at the point of Nelson Mandela negotiating with the ANC, or we could have laughed at the Irish during the Troubles.
You're not sincerely making the comparison. Come on.
I am making the comparison. I think it's always impossible until it's done, and I think it's really important. I don't think it's likely. That's a different question. But I think the first question has to be, do you believe that we can work for peace and diplomacy in the world? Do we believe that we can work with people that we have mass disagreement with, that are they're obviously created an illegal invasion of Ukraine? These are really serious issues. And at the same time, I believe we should never leave the negotiating table. And part of that is showing both the moral and courageous leadership to come on TV and say to you, even though this might be a position that's ridiculed, I don't think we should find peace and diplomacy ridiculous. I think we actually, the most brave and courageous and authentic to do is say, I believe we can have a world without war.
So Prime Minister Polanski would negotiate with President Putin?
Undoubtedly. I think it would be sociopathic behaviour to say you wouldn't negotiate with the President or a Prime Minister of any country.
Can I just ask you, before we move on, you're wearing the white poppy as well as the red poppy. What is the implication of that?
The white poppy began after the First World War, mainly from women's groups who were talking about peace and anti-fascism. So on the same day that we're remembering the fallen, it's also looking ahead to the future and saying we want a world of peace.
All right. Let's talk about COP, the climate conference in Brazil. Prime Minister's coming back, having refused to put British money into the Tropical Forest Forever Fund on the grounds that, frankly, we just can't afford it. He's right, isn't he?
No, it's absolutely outrageous. We often talk about the fact, or the Prime Minister often talks about, that there's no money left, but there always seems to be money for nuclear weapons. We just spoke about that. Since the pandemic began in this country, billionaire wealth has doubled, but our assets, our power and our wealth has been stripped away. And so when it comes to climate negotiations that are international, we need to look at the cost of inaction. And when we look at the Amazon rainforest, for instance, that's often described as the lungs of the world. These are vital resources, both for nature and for our well-being, but also ways of reducing carbon emissions and making sure we have carbon capture. So again, we have a Prime Minister who's spending billions of pounds on carbon capture technology and unproven technology at scale, but can't do the basic investment in making sure that we're protecting forests. Now, he's gone to Brazil. I'm pleased, but what's he gone to Brazil for if he's only gone there to say, oh, I'm not going to give you any more money?
Yeah, but if he were to put money into this kind of thing, I guess he would say, there's your tax rises right there.
A tax rise?
Yeah. How do you pay for it? You tax people.
Well, we could bring in a wealth tax on multimillionaires and billionaires, just a 1% tax on assets of £10 million or more, and a 2% tax on assets of £1 billion or more could raise between 15 and 25 billion pounds. The wider point here, though, is about the cost of inaction. If we continue to allow both internationally and domestically carbon emissions to rise, we know we will face increasing wildfires and floods. Oh. These are both dangerous for people's lives, but also, if we're going to talk about the economy, they're incredibly destructive for our infrastructure and for getting around. And by the way, you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to the insurance companies.
All right. Well, you sound pretty disillusioned with the Labour Party. So perhaps we can just get one thing off the table. There will be no cooperation between Greens and Labour Party to defeat reform.
Well, I don't think I'm alone in my disillusionment. And in fact, a poll out yesterday showed that the majority of the population have completely lost trust in Keir Starmer. Now, this is a man who ran on the coattails of Jeremy Corbyn but ditched every single pledge before he was even in power. We've got the two-child benefit cap, the disability cuts, the genocide in Gaza. No, Keir Starmer is not a man I would be willing to work with. OK, so there will be no electoral deal, however informal, with Labour, even though the division on the left might let reform into number 10? Well, there's two things there. So in a recent poll just yesterday or the day before, Greens are actually outpolling the Labour Party. We're in 3 points ahead. So the real question you should be asking Keir Starmer is, will he stand aside to make sure that Nigel Farage isn't Prime Minister? But more widely, I was answering about Keir Starmer. I don't think Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister at the next election. I think it's another question whether he'll even be an MP. And so will I work with a future Labour leader? Depends who the future Labour leader is.
Oh, who would you like?
It's not really for me to decide who the Labour leader is. What I would like to see is more and more people voting and joining the Green Party, which is why membership of the Green Party has over doubled in the last 2 months. I intend to keep helping make it grow.
OK, but a lot of people in the Labour Party who might fancy some sort of alliance with the Greens would be quite interested to know who they might support in the event that there's a vacancy that would make that alliance easier. Give them some guidance.
Well, I can give some examples. I think Nadia Whittome, for instance, would make an excellent leader of the Labour Party. I don't think it's something she's necessarily in her ambitions right now, nor would the Labour Party, I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying, necessarily support that.
A left-wing MP, a very left-wing MP.
Well, I think you say very left-wing, but actually, when we look at what's happening in this country right now, look how far we've shifted to the right in terms of the conversation around migration, the conversation around privatising our National Health Service through the back door. I don't think these are very left-wing ideals, and I don't think that would be a problem if they were. But actually, what I'm saying is where the majority of the country are at, which is we should nationalise our public services, invest in our National Health Service, and tax multimillionaires and billionaires just a little bit more.
Well, tax multimillionaires and billionaires... only them? That's not going to raise much money.
No, so there's other things, like bringing capital gains tax in line with income tax. The reason why that matters is right now we tax earned income more than we tax unearned wealth. That seems absolutely outrageous to most people as a result of political choices, and we can make different political choices.
The Chancellor, it appears, is likely to raise income tax, maybe 1p, 2p, for everybody. Will your members of Parliament vote for that?
I can't demand what our members of Parliament vote for because they have a free vote, but I would say the principles that we're all standing by is that those with the broadest shoulders should face the biggest burden, and that doesn't make sense to do that across the board universally. People are struggling so hard right now.
So you don't want to rise an income tax?
No, people are tired and exhausted. Their wages haven't gone up, but food prices are going up. How can you make some of the hardest working people who haven't had a pay rise in years pay extra tax and allow multimillionaires and billionaires to continue not paying capital gains?
All right. Your party, probably of all the major parties, has the clearest position on this issue of gender identity and so on. you believe trans women are women. Was the BBC right to censor its presenter Martine Croxall for her eye roll at having to say the words pregnant people?
Well, I push back first of all and say it's not a belief. Trans women are women and trans men are men, and also non-binary identities also exist. And I think it's always important to be really clear about that. In terms of the BBC, they obviously have their own editorial guidelines. It's not for me to tell the BBC how to conduct themselves. In fact, it's for me to be scrutinised. If you're asking me my opinion, though, I think it's really important that journalists are independent and partial. And I think eye-rolling as a journalist is clearly an unprofessional
I think she just said, if trans women are women, why don't we just say women?
If trans women are women, why don't we just say women?
Yeah, who needs pregnant people when you've got the word women?
Well, I think those are different questions to the question you're asking me, which is, should a journalist be eye-rolling? And I just think it's quite obvious, no, they shouldn't.
Zack Polanski, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
OK, we've got to go to a break. But just very quickly, Patrick, Nadia Whittome, leader of the Labour Party.
I have to say, that's the first time I've heard that suggested, including by, I don't think even Nadia Whittome would suggest that herself currently. So, yeah, striking suggestion from Zack Polanski. Let's see if the Parliamentary Labour Party, Nadia's colleagues, are willing to take it up.
You heard it here first. In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Back to our panel, Patrick Maguire, Daisy McAndrew, Kamal Ahmed. Let's survey where we are in the political landscape. I think we've got the polar coaster, which we can have a look at, and we can see the big features here are reform, pretty steady, not moving, continued decline of the so-called big parties. But really interestingly, having just talked to Zack Polanski, the growth of the Greens. Kamal, some of their ideas seem to be getting traction around the place.
I think that Labour has the same problems with the Greens that the Conservatives have with reform, and that's the established parties are struggling to be heard because so many of the public have lost trust with what they're being told over many years that we've been talking about throughout this programme. And then on the right with Nigel Farage and on the left with Zack Polanski, you have people who come across as genuine and say, this is what I believe. If you believe in what I believe, vote for me. Now, Zack Polanski has an advantage over Nigel Farage. He's very new as the leader. Now, last week, Nigel Farage had to undo a lot of his contract with the people from 2024 because, of course, it didn't make fiscal or economic sense. And he had to make a speech last week in the City of London saying he wouldn't be able to do all these tax cuts for people. Zack Polanski hasn't got there yet. So maybe in a year or 2 years, Trevor, when he comes back on your show, you can say, well, you said this thing 2 years ago, but it's not true. So these people have this quite lengthy honeymoon period when they can use television interviews, social media to put forward new ideas, but they haven't been tested yet. He hasn't got to that Farage moment. But that number there that you've just said on the polar coaster should be frightening to Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves.
It's fascinating. Back in the day, the Lib Dems were considered a protest vote. And, of course, they are not considered a protest vote in the same way.
They're part of the establishment.
They're part of having been in a government, they are considered more part of the establishment. And if you add up, how many people are prepared to vote not for Labour and Conservatives and how many are still going to vote for the main two parties. I mean, that's the really extraordinary turnaround, that there's a minority of people in this country, according to polls now, who are still going to vote with the traditional two-party system. And Charles Kennedy, when I worked for him a million years ago, talked then about the tectonic plates of politics shifting and about people becoming very promiscuous with their vote, whereas they had been very steadfast with their vote and would always have voted how their father or mother had voted in the past. Well, that is all history now.
Patrick, we discussed on this programme before that, if you like, the shift in the Labour position. Starmer's speech at conference made it pretty plain that he sees their future as the head of an anti-reform coalition. And I suppose the idea is that would actually bring Labour back to where it's expected to be. To be honest, if you look at that, there's no sign that idea has done them any good.
No, it's a high-risk gambit, put it that way. And what people in Downing Street would say, some of them referencing some polling we had in the Times earlier this week, talking about the possibility for tactical voting by reform, by Lib Dem and Green votes in the next election, is all of this will change when people are in the ballot box, people are in the polling booth, and the question is, do you want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister? But it's a big gamble to try and do that from a position of acute weakness. And Keir Starmer is in a position of acute weakness. He is so singularly unpopular. Now, actually, maybe the flip side of all the volatility we see in that chart, as we saw in Canada, is that if a new leader comes along who isn't Keir Starmer, who isn't as unpopular, maybe he can corral those Green voters behind them. But it will mean actually responding to some of the things Zack Polanski's been saying and sounding a lot less like Keir Starmer sounded over the past 15 months. If
you had to make a bet on Keir Starmer leading Labour into the next election, what odds would you give?
What odds? Oh, God. The phrase escapes me now, but it would, I think, you'd win less than your stake, put it that way.
I think, Trevor, what we need to remember is that Labour is very bad at getting rid of leaders in a way that the Conservatives are too good at getting rid of their leaders. And it's a real... you would have to, under the present number of Labour MPs, would have to be 80 Labour MPs would have to put their head above the parapet and say, we do not have confidence in the present Prime Minister. And, of course, the Parliamentary Party voted against Jeremy Corbyn and he remained as leader. So Labour has a complicated triumvirate approach to how it gets new leaders, which is very, very difficult to push through.
And they also would have to coalesce around a candidate, and there's no clear front runner. And is it? I don't know how many Wes Streeting fans there are out there, or who else might be able to get the support. But there isn't an obvious front runner.
No, there's not, and that is the problem. There is no. I wrote in the Times on Friday. There is no Tom Watson figure, i.e., there is no one who is willing to, as Tom Watson and other Brownites in 2006 did, organise a letter saying to Tony Blair, you've got to name your departure date, including ministers, right? So there's no great organisers like that generation, but neither is Derek Gordon Brown. Neither is there anyone who, at present, people are organising for, and that's because the Cabinet disagree on, one, the fundamental of when they should move, but two, who are they moving, on whose behalf are they moving? Because right now it's wide open, and that encourages everyone to think they can have a crack at it.
It's bizarre, given that the parliamentary party, the Labour parliamentary party, is so big. Yes, a lot of them have quite tiny majorities, but there's a huge number of them, that there aren't more front-runners or people whose heads are coming up above the parapet.
Well, I don't know if there's a sign of anything just before we go to break. There's a bit of breaking news. I think you, Patrick, wrote recently about how former Brownite supporters and, are being brought back into government. We're now seeing, actually, people from the Blair-Brown era coming back. And it's just been announced, literally in the last few minutes, that the former Health Secretary, Alan Milburn, has been recruited to lead an independent investigation into what's behind the rise in youth inactivity, getting young people into jobs. So it looks like the return of the Blair crowd. That may help solve some of this problem.
One gentle suggestion, we don't need more reviews and more policy proposals. We need to get on with doing things.
Yeah.
All right, in just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
A lifeline for millions of people living on both sides of one of the most volatile international borders.
It's dams like these that have become inflection points between the two nuclear-armed neighbours, which could potentially lead to water wars in the future. A terror attack has shattered the peace and tranquility of Kashmir. At least 26 people have been killed and as many injured when militants fired upon them. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
The old and young, all weary after being trapped for days as the worst floods have hit Kerala in a century.
3 days we are on a rooftop. They have no food, nothing.
The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. There have been reported deaths and many injuries, several critical.
Many families will grapple with the unimaginable loss of one of the worst disasters in India's aviation history.
The spiraling violence between two nuclear-armed neighbours that harbour decades of hostility just seems to be getting worse by the day.
Garbage dumps like this not only threaten the lives of millions of people, but also pose a deadly consequence on the environment and climate.
It is a source of death, decay, disease and pollution for hundreds of thousands of people living in its shadows.
There is so much disease because of this garbage. Sometimes it's so difficult to just breathe.
Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration. Over the next 45 days, an estimated 400 million Hindu pilgrims are expected to converge here in Prayagraj on the banks of the holy river Ganga and Yamuna. It's a real kaleidoscope of people from all walks of life.
People that pond together, they have a little hive brain going on.
They've not had a good week.
I've had a good week. There's a teaser there, a teaser.
Oof. OK, nothing to see here. Drama over. Full stop. Anyway, we'll get to that. She will be mortified.
Because she's the first female chancellor.
I popped upstairs, made myself a cheese sandwich, and now I'm with you.
Annalise has come dressed in the magenta of electoral dysfunction. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin.
The waters of Ireland and Britain should be home to great white sharks.
If there are great white sharks in this area, there's no reason they wouldn't come here to feed. It's basically a buffet on a beach. This could be not only a record-breaking storm, but potentially the most dangerous storm ever to hit Ireland.
What might happen if Russia attacked the UK?
This is clearly an enormous show of force.
It is definitely out of the ordinary.
We ran a war game with former ministers back in the hot seat.
Ben Wallace.
Amber Rudd.
Jack Straw.
It's the kind of war game that's genuinely tested inside government.
The Russians are signalling that there may be an attack.
Russia knows our weaknesses, but do you? I'm Deborah Haynes. From Sky News and Tortoise, this is The War Game. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Back to Patrick Maguire, Daisy McAndrew and Kamal Ahmed. By the way, just to avoid confusion, we got our Blair-era cabinet ministers mixed up. It is Alan Milburn who will be heading that review, not Alan Johnson. Big story this week for interest to all of us as journalists. The BBC got itself into various kinds of trouble. Martin Croxall censured for eye-rolling. Frankly, if that were happening, I'd be gone. But I suppose the bigger thing is Donald Trump's press spokesperson described the BBC as a leftist propaganda machine because of the way that a speech by Donald Trump was edited. Daisy, this is troublesome for the BBC, isn't it?
And with so often with these BBC cases, whether they're dealing with Gary Lineker or something else that's gone wrong, the initial crime, in inverted commas, sometimes or very often gets magnified by a seeming lack of ability to respond to it swiftly, to be fleet of foot, to come out on the front foot, she says, mixing her metaphors. And I think this, yet again, yes, the Panorama programme did mess up, it seems to me. They did edit.
The Panorama, they edited Trump's speech about going down to the Capitol.
And they made it look like he was inciting that violence or might be. Now, I mean, I've made mistakes as a journalist. I think we all have, and it's important to come out and say, "I'm sorry, that was a mistake," and put it right. But the trouble with BBC is such a bureaucracy. Everything seems to go through 1,000,001 committees and different layers of structure, and then gets kicked into some long grass somewhere, and somebody writes a report, and then it looks like they're not doing anything.
Kamal, you were a member of some of those committees when you worked at the BBC.
You were part of the problem.
I think there's nothing more boring than a former BBC executive moaning about the present BBC executives and the way they make decisions. And I mean that very honestly. I worked there for 8 years, 5 years on air, 3 years as editorial director of that organisation. You are right, Daisy, that there are very detailed bureaucratic processes in place which don't help the BBC in the public's mind because things are slow. But it is the regulated national broadcaster that has all sorts of systems in place. BBC News creates 9 hours of live content every hour. Of course, it makes mistakes. When I was there, we wanted to do things much more quickly to say when we had. And there were some examples of when we did do things very, very quickly. But ones that got more bogged down on what might be described as nuance or could be at least contested. So although the Panorama programme on Donald Trump spliced together 2 quotes that made it look like he was saying, fight, 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 go to the Capitol. Of course, it has been found against him. He has been found evidence that he was inciting violence. So the Panorama defence is always... These things are always nuanced. So I think it is very difficult in the world we live in to have a nuanced conversation about why these things happen in a world where there are very sharp headlines and the news media moves at 100 miles an hour.
So you're pushing back against the idea that the BBC is a leftist propaganda machine.
Well, I worked there for 8 years. I now work for The Telegraph. I hope people don't think I'm a leftist propagandist. I'm not often accused of that, certainly, possibly the opposite. So when you're in there, Trevor, and you will know, you've worked, fantastic broadcaster at some distance, and so it's not how it works inside. There are people there working incredibly hard to get the detail right, and they misstep every now and again, as you...
Patrick, have they got to apologise?
Well, I'm sure they will, because that's the only way to make the story go away at this point. It's interesting hearing that quote from Caroline Levitt, the White House press secretary. So brutal, because it's often said the BBC is a great agent of British soft power, and at a time when the transatlantic relationship has never been more important. If that perception is taking root in the White House, and we know they have very weird and wonderful views, partly based in reality about Britain. If that's becoming the case, then who knows?
That is it for Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips, this Remembrance Sunday morning. A reminder again of the scene at the Cenotaph, just down Whitehall from where we're sitting now. In just over an hour, the nation will fall silent, led by the King. Stay with us for full coverage from 10 a.m. I'll be back with you next Sunday at 08:30. Join us then.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, this is Sky News Today. It's 10 o'clock. I'm Matt Barbett. Our top stories this morning. The King prepares to lead the nation in 2 minutes silence on Remembrance Sunday. A senior cabinet minister admits mistaken prison releases have gone up under Labour, but insists the government is gripping the crisis. The local council spending tens of thousands of pounds to take down St George's flags in towns and villages across the country. Plus,
this is how the Amazon is disappearing, by literally going up in smoke.
Sky News goes deep into the Amazon rainforest to meet indigenous people who are trying to save their land.